Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's podcast. Inshallah, it's going to be another very special and hopefully enlightening one for everyone. All right. So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes the Muslim, the mu'min in different ayat in the Quran. But there's a specific line of a hadith that I want to reference for us today. Inna amrahu kullahu khayrun. That it's all good. Essentially, it is all good for the believer. It's all good for the believer. And if you look at the situation that we're in, it's hard to find the good in the situation. There's a lot of stress people are dealing with. People are dealing with financial situations where they don't know how they're going to pay their bills. People are dealing with evictions. People are dealing with not having basic money to pay utilities. People's jobs are in question. People's businesses that they've built for years is under threat. And people are talking about the economic fallout that is going to occur during this COVID crisis and afterwards as well. So they're talking about what's going to happen after the fact and how that can even be more damaging than the disease. And one of the things that's being mentioned is that you're going to get rates of suicide. You're going to get an increased rates of suicide, depression, anxiety. And this isn't actually something that's theoretical because this is something that's already happening. The German, one of the finance ministers in Germany, in Frankfurt, he committed suicide. And according to German officials, it was due to the stress of dealing with this pandemic. So because of the stress of this pandemic, this German official who's involved within the financial sector in the government committed suicide, and they found his body, by the, I believe it was some railroad tracks. Yet, inna amrahu kullahu khayrun, that it's all good for the believer. It's all good. What if you get the disease? Is it still going to be good? What if you have close people around you that succumb to the disease? Is it still all good? What if, because of this lockdown, it pushes the limits of your self-control, of your patience? Is it still all good? And this stress and this anxiety is a very major component of this isolation, of this lockdown, of this pandemic that we're facing. Now, there was a study that was done that says that 43%, increased risk of dying if you've encountered severe stress or a major stressful event in the past year. And I think 2020 is already being characterized as one of the most, stressful years of anybody's life because it's touching so many lives and so many people. And if we look at the rates, over 1 million people infected, we have well over 50,000 people who have actually died as a result of this pandemic. So the stress, it could just be beginning and it could just be turning up. Yet, how can we say inna amrahu kullahu khayran, that it's all good for the believer? Yunus Salam, when he was thrown into the blackness of the sea, covered in the blackness of the night, and then swallowed by a whale and isolated upon layers of isolation from the rest of the world. So Yunus Salam, he is under, according to the Mufassirin, that he was actually under the tongue of the whale, and he's isolated in this situation and in this state by himself in a life-threatening and very stressful scenario. What does Yunus salam do in a situation like that? Can he say everything is good for the believer. What is the reaction of Yunus alayhi salam? The commentary on his situation is that he made sujood in a place that nobody else had made sujood before. In that state of isolation, he did an act of worship. He committed himself to an act of worship. He turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where no one else had done that before. And one could say is that because no one had the opportunity to do that before. One could say nobody had the opportunity to make sujood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the whale, under the sea, in the blackness of the night. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put him in that situation, put him in that opportunity. Because what we would sometimes say is that I'm in this prison, I'm in this situation, I'm in this scenario, I'm under this test, I'm under this trial. But rarely do we say I've been given this opportunity to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rarely do we say I have an opportunity to do something great, perhaps, with this environment or the conditions that I've been placed in. And so Yunus alayhi salam, he makes this dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's in sujood where no one else has made sujood before. And he says, La ilaha illa ant. There is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah. Subhanika. Glory be to Allah. Glorified is Allah. All glorified be to you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The greatness, he's acknowledging the greatness of Allah. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who has ordained for him to be in that situation. That everything in the heavens and the earth belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That whether it is seen or unseen, does not escape the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inni kuntu min al-dhalimin. Verily, I was amongst the wrongdoers. This is the Prophet of Allah making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his moment of need, in his moment of opportunity. Everything is good for the believer. It is all good for the believer. Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he says in a hadith that it is strange, wondrous. It's a very wondrous and strange thing, the affair of the believer, because there is good for him in every matter. In every situation, there's good. And this is not the case with anyone except the believer. If he is happy, he is thankful to Allah, and that's good for him. And if he is harmed, he shows patience, and that is good for him. It is all good for the believer. Everything is good for the believer. And you know what's interesting in regards to the study that I mentioned earlier, that if you have a major stressful event in your life, or if you've dealt with a lot of stress in the past year, you have a 43% increased risk of dying. So a 43% increased risk of dying. So there's a lot of diseases associated with stress. Your immune system is affected by stress. So your immune system is actually impaired when you have to deal with a lot of stress. It affects your immune system. Now, there is one difference, though, that can change everything. There's one key difference. And this is non-Muslim studies. So, subhanAllah, they're spending millions of dollars to figure out the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just go to the creator. There was in that same set of data, when they look at these studies, if you simply have the belief that stress is good for you, I'm going to repeat that again. If you simply have the belief that stress is good for you, you have a 0% increased risk of dying. Inna amrahu kullahu khayran. Everything is good for the believer. We should ponder upon that. We should reflect upon that. We should look at our situation as an opportunity. We should look at our condition as a way of turning to Allah, and we should know that everything is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there is always goodness in all of that. So I want to now welcome to the podcast a very dear friend of mine. I've known him for quite a long time, actually, and he's one of those friends that once I start getting into a conversation with him, like the hours will go by like minutes. But we have a short time today for the podcast, and hopefully we can have some good conversation and inshallah spread some useful information to all of you. So he's a practicing lawyer. I think they've sent out or they posted his bio. So I'm not going to take too much time, but I'd like to welcome onto the podcast on Life Haqq podcast, Imran Qureshi. Welcome to the program, brother.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Syed. Can you hear me properly?
So I don't know if this is, just give me a moment here. I just got to make sure my thing is working here. Yeah. All right. Yes, I can hear you.
Can you?
Yes. I can.
Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the podcast. It's good to have you on. Thank you for making the time. How are you holding up?
Alhamdulillah. Under the circumstances, we're doing well. It's a very interesting time. It feels like a dream, and still trying to adjust to everything. A lot of the thoughts and ideas that you shared, I think we've been discussing them over the last couple of days, and so they're certainly holding true. The landscape within my profession is kind of different, but we can go into details depending on what you want to chat about. But alhamdulillah, holding it well.
Well, what's the current effect right now on the legal system with this pandemic? What's happening with our legal system? Maybe that can give people an idea, especially from your area of expertise. What's happening in the court system? Are there cases still being heard, or is there special protocol happening in the courts? Like, is the judge under like a plexiglass, protected? Are people wearing hazmat suits in court? Is court suspended? What's happening? I know you're in litigation, so are people now litigating with these N95 masks, and then they'll look like Bane when they're in court. But what's going on with the court system?
So the situation is as follows: is that the courthouses are, generally speaking, no longer open to the public.
Okay.
And basically they remain open for court filings, which is important, and I'll kind of get to that. But generally speaking, the customary court functions have all been suspended indefinitely. And they've done that in the form of a couple of actual court orders that have been filed and that are available to people who may want to actually read about it. You can go to the Alberta Court's website. We have 3 levels of court in Alberta. And just by way of background, I'm a litigation partner in Alberta, so my practice is restricted to Alberta. But I know, based on communications, that comparable situations are basically in place right across Canada. So in Alberta, we have 3 levels of court. We have 2 courts of first instance, and then we have a court of appeal. The 2 courts of first instance are the Provincial Court of Alberta and the Court of Queen's Bench. Provincial court basically is for, in a very generic sense, matters that are, in terms of damages, are $50,000 or less. Anything above that, plus other special matters designated by statute, they have to be heard by the Court of Queen's Bench. And then if a matter gets appealed from the provincial court, it goes to the QB court, the Court of Queen's Bench. And if something gets appealed from the Court of Queen's Bench, it goes to the Court of Appeal. So we've got 3 levels of court in Alberta. All of them have suspended normal operations, and there are certain limited functions that they're serving. If there are emergency protection orders, family matters, those are being heard on an urgent basis. Certain criminal hearings, limited, not trials, are being heard. And then, of course, if there are what we call emergent applications, they're called injunctions, those are being heard, but only if they are truly urgent. And in fact, some lawyers are interpreting that as it has to be related to actually COVID. I mean, it's that narrow kind of scope to get in front of a judge. Aside from that, everything has been paused. If you have a trial, it's been adjourned sine die, which in Latin means without further notice. And so I had a trial booked for the end of April. That has been adjourned. And we don't know when it's going to be put back onto the trial list. I had another trial booked for the end of May. Unofficially, that's been adjourned. Officially, we'll hear shortly. And so everything is basically in a massive state of suspension. And
but okay, so now that you're mentioning this, so if say you have a person in a scenario where they've been charged with something, could they now just be in prison because the courts are suspended, or because I assume there are things like bail hearings or whatnot, like so could people be in prison for lengthier periods of time because of this, or are the courts erring on the side of more leniency and giving people like temporary bail or letting them whatever on parole or whatever?
So there was a famous, a very well-known case called Jordan from the Supreme Court of Canada, which specifically dealt with the length of criminal trials. And basically, it mandated that steps had to take place within a certain period of time. And if not, it was considered basically an infringement upon the defendant's rights. How all of that is going to play out in the new COVID environment, I would be lying to you if I told you that I had the answer. No one knows the answer, to be honest. These things are actually being figured out in real time. What is the impact of the Jordan case in light of COVID and matters that are being upheld? We don't know the answer to that. It is possible. It is possible. Other timelines and limitation periods that normally apply to legal actions have also been suspended. However, I'm not a criminal lawyer, so if anyone is in that situation, they should probably contact a criminal lawyer and get some specific advice. What I can tell you is that in the civil world, you have very specific timelines within which you have to do things once you're in a court action. Okay, and those are basically just referred to as rule-based or limitations or deadlines within the rules of court. Those have been indefinitely suspended by order of the court. So no one will be prejudiced in the interim during this COVID crisis. Similarly, there's another type of a deadline that's called a limitation period. That's the period of time within which you must commence a claim after you know that you have it. Every province and territory in Canada has their own limitations act. And Alberta basically requires you to commence an action 2 years from the date you had a claim. That too has been suspended in light of COVID. So, by analogy, by extension, I would imagine that the Jordan timelines in the criminal context would also have some cessation, some suspension. However, I urge and I disclaim any of the listeners that if they do have, a kind of a personal connection to a criminal matter, that they would definitely need to take that up with criminal defense counsel.
Yeah, and I assume that everything else either is because of the suspension, they're giving extensions, right? So if people are applying for immigration and there's deadlines associated with that, if people are dealing with issues regarding PR card and citizenship, whatever, they're all probably going to be given I would assume automatic extensions if they have deadlines coming up.
Well, one would hope that that is the case. The fact of the matter is, I returned to my comment earlier, is that this is all happening in real time. So there are a lot of government agencies that may not have officially updated their policies and protocol, whether it be through immigration or otherwise. But we're getting to that point. You know, the CRA is basically put out some information bulletins about extending when everyone's one would assume that because of the environment that we're in, that there would be reasonability and there would be basically an official kind of guideline that says everything is extended. I haven't seen any such universal bulletin, which kind of across the board extends by default as a result of COVID, any government mandated, any kind of committee or agency mandated deadline. But what I can say is with respect to legal action, both a limitation in order to commence an action as well as timelines within the body of a legal action have been indefinitely suspended by order of court.
Okay. And now there's a few things that I've thought of, and to get your your perspective or your mind on it. There's been articles that have come out in the past week. There's been talk, at least in the news, that there's the possibility of an Emergencies Act, being implemented. And I think that's formerly known as the War Measures Act. Okay, so what does that mean, like in terms of, for the average citizen, if they are able to enact the Emergencies Act, is it now like we're in a lockdown state? Is it like going to be like an authoritarian state? What does it look like for the average Canadian citizen if they do enact the Emergencies Act?
Well, I guess the immediate answer to that would be what is in the act itself. It's very difficult to kind of hypothesize what kind of impact that would have without actually getting a first reading of that document. It would basically be a piece of federal legislation on an emergency basis. One thing that we would look for in that is a sunset clause of some sort, and that would be a clause within the legislation that refers to its own ending. Okay, so when does the sun set on that emergency kind of powers legislation? And that's very important, because I think when we were chatting about this last time, I kind of used the example how everyone pays income tax. We've got an income tax act in Canada. Once upon a time, Canadian, but prior to the First World War, the Canadian government mainly raised its revenues through tariffs and custom excises and things of that nature. And during the First World War, they decided to institute on a temporary basis the Income Tax Act, and I think its name was like the Income War Tax Act or something like that. And here we are, however number of years later, and the act is still, it may not be in its original form, but everyone can see how a piece of legislation come in. It's important to be mindful that they have a clearly delineated kind of sunset clause or mechanism for review, because that's the powers that you're conferring to a federal government in an emergency are extraordinary. They're not supposed to be used in ordinary circumstances. And I can tell you this without actually having read it. No one has read it. I can tell you that it would infringe most likely upon certain charter rights and freedoms. And the charter rights and freedoms that we have in Canada are kind of inalienable, and they're designed to basically protect one against improper legislation by any order of government, municipal, provincial, or federal. and you know, most likely an Emergency Powers Act would infringe upon it. So, and I'm sure they would engage something called a notwithstanding clause to basically kind of rebuff any court challenge to it. So the sunset clause is what I would be looking for. That being said, you know, I don't see in the short term any immediate threat based on what has been discussed, kind of, you know, anecdotally so far.
Yeah,
And
I think, you know, I think the reason why some of this rhetoric is coming out, and by the way, just to let you know, you've been cutting out a little bit, so I don't know if your internet connection is a little bit slow. So just I don't know if you're able to modify anything on your end, but
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but sometimes it starts cutting out and it lags and slows down. So I'm getting word that it could possibly be the internet connection from where you are at. But the reason why I bring this up, and it's very interesting, by the way, what you mentioned, the fact that Income Tax Act was supposed to be a temporary measure after World War I, and that never left. So, you know what I mean? So who knows what they implement today could now be the new normal, right? Like it'll be with us forever. Because we've been paying into income tax, you know, since then. I mean, we didn't know that at one point that they didn't have an income tax. Now, the reason why I say this is, it's, you know, subhanallah, a duality between, you know, the instructions you're getting from leaders and people of authority, and then this natural disposition of people to perhaps rebel. So, for example, in Ontario, they're talking about that you can get fines if you ignore, you know, some of the government's orders of staying away from basketball courts and playgrounds and recreational facilities. You can get fined from anywhere from $750 to $100,000. You could be facing jail time. Okay. And I can understand why, because there's a frustration that they're trying to get the whole, like, everyone to play ball. They're trying to get everybody to go with the program. And then you have people who are taking it like vacation. Okay, yeah, we can play basketball, or we'll go do this. We'll, you know, get together, have house parties, whatever, what have you. And so that's extremely frustrating. And then in grocery stores, then on the other hand, you might have like a Paul Blart, right? Like this overzealous, you know, mall cop who's like going around with a tape measure, you know, like, you guys aren't the proper 6 feet away from each other, and, you know, starting to get upset. Like, I saw an article of somebody who was a former bouncer in a bar, right? And he's talking about how frustrated he is trying to get people, like, you know, away from each other at the grocery store. Part of that could be like people aren't taking the rules seriously, but could it be like, you know, those people who don't know how to use wisdom and trying to get people to follow the rules? You know what I mean? So I think the reason why I'm saying this, I could see the situation getting out of hand. You can have people who take it hyper seriously and start freaking out if you break like these certain guidelines of it's like, you touched your face, and then they're videotaping. Why'd you touch your face? Why didn't you sneeze into your elbow, bro? And then, you know what I mean? It's a confrontation. And then on the other hand, people just like don't care. They're having parties. They're ignoring all the rules. So you can have these people without giving clear guidance. Hey, this is how we need to conduct ourselves. This is what happens when you break the rules. And that's why I asked this, because I can foresee an Emergencies Act being implemented if things get out of hand. You know what I mean? From both sides. Like, you can have people who just are taking this opportunity to like make you like really stickler for everything within the rules, and then you could have some people who are just laissez-faire. They don't care. They're just they just want to do what they want to do, type of thing. You know what I mean? So this is the
I think there is a real risk of legislation like that being misapplied. First of all, you're right. I think it would only be all the signals that we're getting right now from the federal government is that something like that would probably be instituted if they feel the powers they have right now through local law enforcement and the military are somehow insufficient. The whole purpose of legislation would be to enable them to do something that they currently can't do right now, and that
because you heard about what happened in New York, right? They have like several thousand police officers that have tested positive for COVID-19. So
Right.
that's another threat, right? You're trying to implement the law, and if do police officers, for example, have personal protective equipment?
All of this stuff is totally uncharted waters. Like from a legal point of view, there is everything in the law operates on the basis of what's been enacted through legislation and statute, or based on what we call kind of previous precedent, judge-made law, the common law, received law. And the problem when you're dealing with this situation, the situation that you're describing, where there is a breakdown in law and order because law enforcement is compromised, and you've got absenteeism from the police force, and the police force may or may not have protective equipment, and they are or are not enforcing the laws properly, and you've got a breakdown in kind of that law and order situation. There are very few historical precedents for that in Canada, and within a public health context, almost none. None, actually. I should just go out and say that. None. What we are seeing unfolding before our eyes is the precedent. And so, if we can kind of like role play this or war game this, that's what we call it litigation when we're fighting another side. But if you use a hypothetical and you try to stretch it out, the courts do remain open for challenges to a piece of legislation like an Emergency Powers Act. Remember, I mentioned that at the beginning. The courts are open for injunctions. So you could theoretically go in there to get portions of it restricted or struck out, or certain agencies and departments not being able to carry out the powers that they believe have been conferred to them through this legislation. So that's number one. But what would that look like? No idea, because there's no previous case to compare it to.
Yeah. And I think there's going to be I feel there's going to be a lot of litigation right now, because even with whether you're talking about insurance, whether you're talking about tenant landlord, whether you're talking about employment issues, as you said, this is uncharted water, for everybody, absolutely everybody. And with that chaos, that's why I feel it is so important at times like this to keep your sanity, is to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know what I mean? Like, and not get swept up with all the uncertainty, because at the end of the day, you have to live by your, I would say, core principles, or this might be a time for you to evaluate your core principles.
Right.
And then after that, you can't really control the situation. Like, for example, some of the things that I've seen, like just prior to a lot of the lockdown or legislation that occurred, I was I took my family to the mall, and I used one of the public restrooms, and as Muslims, to us, using the restroom is not a spectator sport, right? So you don't even want to be in the peripheral vision of anybody. When you're the rest, right? You don't want to be, right? Yeah. They shouldn't have any idea what's going on. So anyways, I come out of the stall, because we're going to use a stall no matter what, right? Number one, number two, doesn't matter. That's where we're going to go. But I see a guy who's walking away. He just walked away from the urinal and literally just started walking out the door. I'm going straight to the sink to wash my hands, and this guy's just walking out the door. Not okay. Now I want you to think about this. What kind of threat to society is this? This guy is going to touch door handles. This guy is going to touch um, debit machines. This guy is going to touch the buttons on the Moneris button machine there. You know, he's going to touch tables and chairs. Man, some of his you know, the residue can be on change. And then you get that change. You know, you get the bills and change is jingling around in your pockets, right? Can I make a citizen's arrest on this guy? Like, what is my legal right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Because this is a threat. I think this is a threat to the community. Like, can we quarantine people like that and say, hey, we have an automatic volunteer to test out COVID vaccine? Like
why Dr. Syed, why do all of our discussions end up at citizens arrest? That's what I want to know.
It's like, when can I make a citizen's arrest? You know,
yeah.
But you understand? It's people like that. You know what I'm talking about, Imran? It's people like that. That, you know, it's like throw everything out of whack. It's people like who you're telling them 1,000 times to wash your hands. Well, no one's gonna tell me how to wash my hands. You know what I mean? Like, you can't tell me what to do. And so I think it's those few boneheaded people who cause, like, because of them, sometimes, you know, you make the rule for the exception, and that harms the general society. You know, like in Islam, you never make the exception the rule, right? So in Islam, we have like you would do something, say, out of darura, out of necessity, or there's certain legal terminology that this is an exception. This is the blanket rule. So, for example, Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would have a blanket rule, but then you would see certain exceptional circumstances where that rule would be lifted. Right. You know what I mean? But so, I feel in society, because of oftentimes extremes or like aberrant behavior, you can get rules that affect the masses because of that. You know what I mean? I think you may have frozen on me, or maybe I got you back.
Sorry, it just kind of. Can you hear me now? It was just froze on me a little.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I missed the last part of what you were saying, but I'm going to jump in on this whole idea of you know, kind of these people walking around in society, and you know, there's we know what they look like and what they sound like. In America, they're especially prevalent, kind of, you know, for lack of a better term, libertarian, don't tread on me, and they have this. They take this. Like their rights, their civil rights, they hold them so dear, they weaponize them, and they use them almost like property. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, extremely important, very important to know what your rights are or aren't. But look at your courthouses. Look at the law offices in town. Look at any other business. If this pandemic does not push you back and remind you that we are not in control as much as we like to believe, then nothing will.
Yeah.
There's one judge or maybe two that's sitting in downtown courthouse that's dealing with emergency matters, okay? And that's kind of the backlog. That's, you know, what's happening. That's the reality. The whole province, the country, but certainly the province has come to a standstill. And, you know, from my selfish point of view, from my vantage point in the law, I can tell you it's absolutely no different. And people imagine that you know, all of this that we have, you know, the rule of law and all of this type of stuff, it is a defining characteristic of Canadians that we're very proud of. And in fact, you know, I believe that you can trace the origins of that tradition right back into Islam. There's no doubt about that. In my mind, that there's a direct link. But if you think that everything that you see around you is everything, it's reality, it's the be all, it's the end all, I think those people have gotten a reality check. They've gotten, you know, and you said it I think, very, very well. If you pick up the phone and you dial 911, God forbid, for any reason, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months from now, you don't know whether or not there will be a police officer that responds to it. And if they do, you don't know whether or not they're compromised. And I mean, so there's a question mark over everything. Lawyers are notorious for, when being asked a yes or no question, to say maybe and then go on for like 30 minutes. And
and then charge you for that, right?
And then you get the full bill, right? Ha ha ha. But the point is, that you want to talk about uncertainty. You want to talk about question marks in a time there's no definitive answer. Someone kind of wake up has to. The rules are there. You follow them. You abide by them. You use them. Hire lawyers and you understand them. You work with them. But if you begin to think that all of this window dressing is kind of an indicator of the fundamental reality, the core reality of one's existence, you're wrong. And you've been proven wrong. Nothing works, nothing applies anymore. There's no, this thing doesn't recognize power. By the time it's done, it will have knocked on every household in the world. Think about that. No one can stop it, at least for now, unless Allah has decided that no one will stop it. There's no vaccine, there's nothing. And when he wills, there will be a vaccine. And inshallah, we hope for that to be sooner rather than later. But right now, I mean, think about this. You have the most, speaking at least, the most powerful person in the world in the White House. And, in all of his buffoonery, he had no idea. He was like high-fiving and hugging some Brazilian, diplomat. The guy was tested positive for COVID 2 days later. He could have gotten it. There's no security gate at the White House or, at Parliament Hill.
There's no missile defense system for this.
There's no missile defense system. There's nothing. And in basically a 2 to 3 week cycle, we have now been shown that we are not in control. We like to tell ourselves, we can split an atom, and the energy that's released from there, we can obliterate cities. We can put a man on the moon. We can cure this. We can cure that. We can, drill hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers into the earth and extract minerals from it. I mean, we can do things that were unfathomable for the generations, and everything has come to a standstill. So, I think that's extremely important to remember, is that if you are placing your hope and trust solely and exclusively in kind of society's common conventions and institutions, they're going to be under significant stress. Don't add to the stress. Support them, build them, work with them, and especially for the rule of law, because we really are all in this together. But on a personal belief level, don't assume that this is going to be short-lived and the institutions will win the day and all. I mean, you see a lot of this messaging that's kind of out there, this kind of goodwill spirited type of messaging, which is, at the end of the day, you got to ask yourself, like, okay, well, what does it mean? We'll get through. There's it's plastered on shutters in downtown and other places. We will get through this. Neighbors are putting it on their lawn. That's all nice, fine, and dandy. But the cold reality is that we don't have the answers to this, and that is exactly what we should be feeling right now. We don't have. Okay, we don't have the answers. Yes, rush to a vaccine. Yes, take all the social distancing and quarantine and public health protocol very seriously. Follow it religiously, but don't miss the question. The whole point of the exercise is, holy smokes, we don't have an answer to this. And in a way, it's financial.
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. That, and just to repeat for the viewers, because you're cutting out there, Imran is saying that we don't have an answer for everything, and we put our hopes. Essentially, I would add to that the commentary. I think the more devastated we are is directly related, is proportional to the hope we put in something. So if you put all your hope, like your ultimate hope and your trust, in a system that is shown to, in a very short period of time, start to fall apart and start getting a little shaky, uh, that affects your state of mind, your state of well-being. But if we put our hope and our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that will never shake. We'll never be truly shaken, because we understand then the worst thing that can happen to you is not getting sick. The worst thing that can happen to you is not even dying. The worst thing that can happen to you is that you lose your core character. You lose your iman. You destroy your akhirah. That is the worst thing that can happen to you, right? That, for people, if they feel, hey, the worst thing that can happen to me is I'm sick, of course you're going to be wrapped in anxiety. Of course, you're going to be in so much stress. Of course, you're going to be so disheartened and in desperation and depressed when you see, the system being shaken as it is. And you can even see in the rhetoric that people have. We're saying we're at war with COVID. You understand what I'm saying? The rhetoric that's used is the same rhetoric that they use for the war on terror. We're at war with COVID. We're fighting COVID. We're battling COVID. You know what I mean? How can you say you're fighting them? Like, who are you going to kill? Like the person who's infected?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, how are you going to? You can only try to endure it. You can try to deal with it. But to use that same terminology as if we want to get revenge, like COVID killed my family.
Right.
Who are you gonna kill? Right? What defense system is gonna protect you from that? Right? So I think you're absolutely correct. Our mentality in how we are responding and how we're reacting to such a situation, it's like immediately it's materialistic. The immediate knee-jerk reaction, it's a materialistic reaction. We're talking about the economy. We're talking about all of these things. But I would say, amongst even Muslims, brother, when we're talking about this pandemic and we're talking about people possibly dying, and there's tens of thousands, over 50,000 people that have died already, and these numbers may be even lagged behind if we see how things progress. And how many Muslims at this point who are dealing with this, they turn in a material, now just in a material sense, how many of us have made sure we have proper wills? You understand what I'm saying? So on one hand, we need to make the spiritual, the internal, the reflection and preparation, and turn to Allah and the akhirah, and realize what our position in the akhirah could be. But at the same time, when we talk about practical, we talk about, okay, let's talk, okay, what about materially? Are Muslims should respond anything materially? Should we not care anything about the dunya? No, of course we need to care about we make our plans and whatnot. But how many people have, even from an Islamic perspective, because it's important, it's actually, Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said if anyone has anything to bequeath, shouldn't even let 2 days pass without making a will. How many people even made have a will in place? You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. And that's an excellent point. Is that this dichotomy between the material and metaphysical. I'll come to that in a second, because I think the metaphysical has been completely ignored. We've talked about this at length, and which is really disturbing, because if you do not look at this through the lens of the unseen, if you do not look at this through the lens of what this is, why this is happening, you stand to actually lose every opportunity. And opportunity is kind of what you talked about at the outset.
If you can't look at it now,
Yeah.
How will you ever be brought to look
How
at it?
will you ever wake up?
What world event could ever happen? What sign from Allah could ever
Yeah.
make you do that?
Yeah, there is nothing kind of beyond this point, short of a nuclear holocaust, and even in that, no one would be around to discuss. So, I mean, if you can't sit and think and ponder now, you're in trouble because you brought up the will. Even and this whole idea about kind of like the war on COVID and we will defeat this, and it just represents the internal angst you're trying to project that outwards. Because you feel scared and you're unsure and you're uncertain. And again, instead of actually trying to work through that, you project that outwards and you say, we will defeat you. Dark, dangerous shadow COVID, we will take care of you. And instead of talking about things like wills, we're talking about things like resolving issues amongst family members or business associates. I haven't been getting phone calls about, I want to settle my lawsuit. Call the other side, and I haven't been getting those.
Yeah, forgiveness. Where's the forgiveness, man?
Where's the forgiveness in this?
Well, I'm not the mercy of Allah. You want the mercy of Allah, right?
Right.
And we can be merciful to one another.
Right. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that I'm not hearing that. I'll tell you what I am hearing and what I'm seeing and what I'm reading. People are rushing out and they're trying to stockpile as much toilet paper as possible. You can do a separate lecture on that, probably just covering, the the Islamic angle on the hygiene issue. But we hear about people running out and buying guns, Dr. Syed.
Yeah. I spoke about that earlier.
So they're worried again. They're of the mentality that I'm going to, I'm going to take somebody else out if someone comes onto my property or knocks at my door at the wrong time. It's self-preservation. And contrast that with, I think, the mindset of a believer that says, I've got to go at some point. This is a reminder. Let me get my affairs in order, and let me get, a will done, or let me, let me forgive the person that I should have forgiven a long time ago, or let me seek forgiveness from the person that I should have sought out a long time ago. And instead, people are going out and they're buying guns. They're stockpiling food, and they're binge watching Netflix. And it's like, okay, well, I get it. Boredom is a thing. But there's got to be some balance here. Look, if you go through this, if we all go through this, and it was a giant exercise in how to kill boredom. I mean,
that's
really?
That's the biggest, message out of all of this.
So far, it's the biggest preoccupation, is like parents complaining about young children at home, children complaining about being bored, they're not getting their schoolwork done. These are all real, legitimate concerns to a point.
Yeah.
They cannot define the crisis. They're not why it happened.
Yeah. Or that opportunity. Now you have time with your children. Maybe you've been complaining for years, I wish I had more family time. And now that you do have time with your family, what are you doing with your family? And
Absolutely.
And the anxiety that we have with, and I spoke about this before, with death, and people look at that as the worst thing that can happen to you.
Right.
But subhanallah, how Islam gives you true freedom. Islam gives you the greatest amount of freedom that a person can ever experience, because a person, vast majority, most of the population, they're enslaved with the thought of death. So if a person now is not afraid of death, they're truly free. They're truly freed to now, instead of the fear of death, do they, do their actions. So for example, a person won't say the truth because they're afraid, maybe their job, their sustenance, to the extreme that, okay, I could, it can lead to my life being threatened. Okay, to stand up for the truth. But once you remove the fear of death, you are truly free. You are truly free of worry and anxiety. You are truly free to be controlled by people. And I find a quote by Malcolm X so powerful. He said something that really hit me home, because I can see similar statements made by the Sahaba and by righteous people throughout history when it comes to the issue of death. You know what Malcolm X said? He said, I already died. He's like, I'm a man who believed I died 20 years ago, and I live like a man who is dead already. I have no fear of whatsoever of anybody or anything.
Right.
That's a person who has truly accepted Allah in their life. That is a person who will not submit themselves to a human being, because the only thing that they can submit themselves is to Allah. That is a person who is not chained by death, but is made free by the reality of this world and the akhirah.
Absolutely. And, just really quickly, just to kind of build on that, I was listening to a lecture not too long ago that was talking about kind of the difference between, I think it was Sheikh Umar Suleiman, about the difference between insan and humankind and the malaika. And one of the things that was mentioned was that, for human beings, our desires act as a veil or distance between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas for the malaika, their only desire is to worship. That's how they were created. And so the challenge, the test, of course, is how do you control, how do you battle, how are you tested by your own desires in the face of knowing that you've got this great being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is worthy of our worship and no one else is. Well, we're now in a situation where so many of those day-to-day desires and distractions have been suspended. And it's not even like you have to make an excuse for it. It's happened for you. You can't go into work. You can't. And I really want to emphasize this for myself and for anyone that's listening, and when I talk to friends and family about it. If we cannot take advantage of a time that has been given to us where we can be uninterrupted, largely speaking, in our worship, in our contemplation, in our thinking, then we've just completely lost the plot. We've completely lost it. Yeah. And getting rid of the fear of death, I think that is a very advanced goal, I think, of believers. And inshallah, I hope that at some point we can all get there. But even if you can start with kind of taking advantage of the suspension of your day-to-day desires and distractions, that is kind of along the path, right? You gotta build to get there. And once you're able to really suppress this stuff and realize how futile it is, then you begin to come closer. Then you realize that actually nothing in this world, I suppress this, I suppress that, I've got control of this, I got control of that. Well, what is death? Well, death is basically, within our tradition, alhamdulillah, it's not the end. Yeah. It's basically a complete cessation from this world, right? Yeah. And so this should be a reminder of some indication of death of sorts, and not physical death. Talking about the physical transformation with the suppression of desires, where you're able to kind of go beyond. Yeah, and that's really what Malcolm X was talking about. Obviously, he wasn't physically dead. Yes. He was free. He was free of all of the attachments, the chains, and all the baggage that comes with being alive. Those material vices that chain you down, that prevent you from being
you know, a true sense of a child of Adam alayhi salam. One thing I want to touch upon, I usually don't take questions from the stream or look at the comments, but this is an important one that was forwarded to me. I just maybe get a quick response from you, and that is, you know, what advice could you give? What legal advice, perhaps, as well, maybe in terms of people who are maybe in the state of isolation, but they're going through some type of physical or emotional abuse within the household. So, what you know, maybe from a legal perspective, can this person do? Because we know from a dean perspective that everyone has their own test. Some people are going through abuse. Some people going through that emotional, you know, mental abuse, physical abuse. Some people are unjustly imprisoned. There's oppression happening. There's you know, all sorts of different problems that a person's doing. A person could be right now in the ICU battling for their life. So everyone has their own test, and ultimately, spiritually, we turn to Allah. Ultimately, we don't fear a person. Ultimately, we should not fear death. But yet, as an amana to our body, we need to fight to preserve our life. You know. So yes, we need to make ourselves with a strong will, you know, to do that. And part of that is, yes, you know, we should seek justice for ourselves or people that we know who are oppressed. And so, as part of that process, as a Muslim, what legal advice do you have in regards to that?
Well, you know, we are going through a profound period of where we're being tested, but nowhere within any tradition is it mandated that one withstand physical violence, violence to the person, abuse of any sort. That's a different category, right? That's a different category. So if someone is undergoing abuse that is threatening their person, that is threatening another member of the household, physically, mentally, emotionally, that's obviously not healthy. And the name of the game here is not to withstand that. That's not, you know, that's not how we're collecting points. This will be different, but I want to, notwithstanding that we were talking about earlier about institutional power being inherently limited and full control and powers with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the institutions are in Canada, in Alberta, are all fully functional, you know, as of right now. And if one feels the need to reach out to law enforcement, if things are really that bad, then they should do so. And they should not hesitate in that regard. I know a lot of people are confused and saying, well, if I just punish more confusion, again, I reiterate, no one is expected to endure abuse. That's not part of the program under any conditions, COVID or otherwise. What I would also say is if people feel as though they're in a bit of a gray area, it's not necessarily where they feel there's an immediate risk to their personal safety, but they are just at it. You know, they are at their wits' end and someone is really emotionally abusing them, mentally abusing them. There are other institutions and organizations that are in place. One of the, in my opinion, one of the Muslim community's best organizations, best run and organized organizations. There's no point in trying to reinvent the wheels here. They have professionals there to deal with these types of situations, and they act almost as.
Which organization did you mention? Which organization? IFSA. Okay. So I just want to repeat what you said here because you are cutting out here a little bit. So I just want you to pause here every once in a while so I can just repeat what you said. So if there is obviously a life-threatening situation of abuse, your life and limb is in jeopardy, then everything is still fully functional in terms of law enforcement and getting that, you know, getting protective services or whatever that you would require. But I think you make a good point that if it's a gray area, then there is some you don't necessarily have to take those full measures. So contacting IFSA, you said an organization to deal with that. Would you agree then also perhaps even contacting like imams of masajid, perhaps depending on the imam? Like I know the different imams have different areas of expertise, but some are quite helpful. There are some imams that are willing to help. And I think that we should never undermine, like, yes, you do have IFSA. You do. Are there other Islamic organizations that specialize in this area?
I think IFSA is built for this. They're the Islamic Family Social Services Association, and they're true leaders. And when it comes to family counseling, when it comes to references to psychologists, we have registered, licensed, practicing Muslim psychologists in the city. And they work with IFSA. They also can be contacted privately and independently.
So this is restricted to Edmonton. So a lot of our viewers are from all over Canada. So
right.
I want to give them more broader advice. So if there is an organization that specifically deals with family and social services issues, then you should contact them. And then certain I would say another thing from the Islamic perspective, that reaching out to your family members too. So like, you have, whether it's your parents, whether it's your siblings. So reaching out to family members as well. This is part of the Islamic tradition of mediation.
Absolutely.
And obviously you try to pick those who are going to de-escalate the situation rather than escalate the situation. I think also in a time like this, because this is still within regulation and what's being given as instructive guideline from Canadian government. But if family members need to stay with other family members for periods of time for things to cool off, because things can get heated perhaps, and people can be in each other's face, and being in close proximity to one another can lead to this. And for many areas in Canada, it's very cold. You might not necessarily be able to go for a walk or spend a lot of time outdoors anywhere. So maybe perhaps, and you can't even really go to the masjid and stay there for long periods of time. So maybe finding a family member's house, if you're able to, their home, and staying there for a period of time can also, like, these are, I would say, some of the in this gray area, some more mediative steps that one could probably take.
And what I would go one step further than that, Dr. Syed. I know we're probably running out of time. We don't have that much time left. But one thing that I would say is that what you and I have been chatting about up until now have been reactive measures. It is incumbent, I think, upon everyone that can do so to take proactive measures. So don't wait for something to go wrong. Don't wait for someone to light the fuse in a verbal argument. I think we have to be proactively forgiving. I think we have to be proactively coming up with schedules and activities that kind of create a light atmosphere. It can be a bit of a double-edged sword if you have too many heart-to-heart discussions too often, because when people are being real, and when people are being very, absolutely candid, you don't know what direction that can go in. So it's a bit of a balancing act. But I think it is important to be proactive in mindset about wanting to actively, for the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trying to improve relations, because that's the ultimate goal, right? If you start out with the proper objective, it doesn't matter how hard you try. So, you make sure you have the proper niyyah, make sure you have the proper intention, and then you go out with a proactive mindset, actively trying to there are damaged relations, and just trying to proactively remain kind of in as tranquil a state and light a state as possible.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things that you touched upon, some practical means, is that, just let things go. If things are going to escalate a situation, silence is better. Silence is better than speaking. And as you mentioned as well, using humor, trying to keep things light. Everything doesn't have to be serious. Everything doesn't have to be a confrontation. You don't have to like release your stress and your tension out, on the people around you. Whatever you put out in the world is going to come back to you. That's what's
Right.
going to happen. So if you want to be happy, you put happiness out. If that's how you want to feel, put that out. If you want to laugh, make somebody else laugh.
Right.
And I think this is a time, as you mentioned, we can seriously work on that aspect of communication and relationship. I'm gonna let you go, bro, because I know you have to go and you stayed longer than we had it first originally planned. But Jazakallah khair for coming on. I apologize to the viewers. We're having this technical issues, and we're going to make sure that we put some considerations in place and hopefully avoid this in the future. Inshallah, we'll have another bonus podcast on Saturday at noon with Sheikh Abdurrahman Murad. So that'll be really awesome to have him on. And then, bro, I think we should have you on again. And this issue of wills, I want to talk to you about again. So, if we want to set up our will, what is the next few steps that we can go about it? So obviously, you being a Muslim lawyer would be awesome for that because, from an Islamic perspective, there's certain things that we would want in our will. But I think a lot of people haven't even done that step of going ahead and setting that up. So I think that would be a very useful future episode that we can get you involved. And then hopefully we can sponsor you to have better than a dial-up connection. Because it was like talking to somebody from like 15 years ago. Like I'm talking to a time capsule from 15 years ago. And you're just waiting for somebody picked up the phone on your end, and then now it's like a slow connection, or it's getting disconnected. So yeah, we'll try to connect with you, inshallah, in a better
Inshallah,
way.
I would love to come back. Okay, sounds good, brother. Take care.
All right, those. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you to our viewers for being patient and sticking around with all these technical issues. Like I said, inshallah, we'll get this resolved. It's a little bit tricky when we have different guests because they all have different conditions that they're broadcasting from. So, inshallah, we'll try to get that improved. And we'll see everyone on Saturday for a bonus session for the Life Haqq podcast. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I looked for protection from Allah.